In the sweltering heat of a Texas summer, the small town of El Paso felt like a pressure cooker waiting to burst. The oppressive humidity clung to the air, making the streets shimmer, and the houses look like they were melting in the sunlight. The dusty roads and sun-baked buildings had a sense of stillness to them, a calm that made the inevitable storm all the more jarring when it hit. Life moved at a steady pace, and people in this close-knit community had long believed that they knew their neighbors well. But in the house at 1422 Tarrant Avenue, things were about to unravel in the most unimaginable way. Mary Lou Smith had always been the picture of grace in the town, a devoted wife to her husband, Officer Thomas Smith, and a loving mother to their 13-year-old daughter Lily, who had special needs. Mary Lou wore her roles like a badge of honor. To those on the outside, their marriage seemed ideal, perfect even. The family lived in a comfortable, well-kept house on a quiet street, and Thomas's job as a police officer brought in a steady income. They were the kind of family everyone admired from a distance. But beneath the picture-perfect exterior, Mary Lou's world had been slowly eroding. For years, she had agreed to an open marriage, a decision that she thought would help their relationship. Mary Lou had loved Thomas deeply once, and while they still cared for each other, the passion in their relationship had long since faded. They had come to terms with the idea of being open with one another, both pursuing outside relationships. For Thomas, it had been a series of brief affairs with women who were willing to keep things quiet. Mary Lou had tried to ignore the lingering resentment she felt every time she found out about another one of Thomas's flings. But it was Lily, their daughter, who had always been their constant. Born with developmental delays, Lily required round-the-clock care. Mary Lou had sacrificed her own career and dreams to be there for her, while Thomas often worked long hours, barely able to contribute to Lily's daily needs. The strain this placed on their marriage was significant, but they had learned to cope, or at least that's what Mary Lou thought. It was late one evening when everything changed. Mary Lou had returned early from a visit to her mother's house. She had been gone for just a few hours, and in that time, Thomas and Lily had been home alone. The house was silent as she pulled into the driveway, but there was something off about it. As she opened the door, the first thing she noticed was the faint smell of something burning, mixed with a sense of panic in the air. Mary Lou's heart began to race as she walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. Her gaze fell upon the hallway leading to Lily's bedroom. Her daughter's door was ajar, and a sense of dread washed over her. When Mary Lou approached, she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Thomas was there, but it wasn't the man she had once loved. His clothes were disheveled, his face twisted in a mix of shock and pain. And Lily, her sweet, innocent daughter, was standing in front of him. There was no confusion in Mary Lou's mind about what she had walked in on. She knew exactly what she was seeing. It was the worst thing imaginable. The betrayal Mary Lou felt in that moment was suffocating. It wasn't just that Thomas had been unfaithful to her. It wasn't just the years of emotional distance. No. What shattered Mary Lou's soul was that he had crossed a line that no one could ever forgive. He had hurt their daughter. In that moment, something inside Mary Lou snapped. All the years of frustration, anger, and resentment exploded into a single, irreversible decision. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed the handgun from the drawer, her hands shaking with fury. Before she could think, before she could even make sense of the emotions flooding through her, she pulled the trigger. Thomas crumpled to the ground, a gurgling noise escaping his mouth as he fell. Lily screamed, her voice echoing in Mary Lou's ears, but the noise was muffled by the shock of what she had just done. It wasn't until Mary Lou looked down at her hands, stained with her husband's blood, that she realized what had happened. Lily was still standing there, frozen in terror. But Mary Lou didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to explain what had just occurred. The world, for a brief moment, seemed to stand still. And then, in a blur of disbelief and horror, Mary Lou turned the gun on her daughter. The second shot was almost instinctive. Lily's small frame crumpled to the floor in an instant, her lifeless eyes staring up at her mother. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the weight of what Mary Lou had just done. The deed was done. The storm had arrived. A few hours later, the first responders arrived at the scene. The house was a quiet, blood-stained shell of a family that once was. The police were quick to begin their investigation, though they were initially confused by the scene. A mother, a daughter, and a husband all dead in one place, yet there was no immediate explanation for why it had happened. Detective Evan Harris, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience, was called in to handle the case. Harris had seen countless tragedies, but this one felt different. The circumstances were far from clear, and there was something unsettling about the whole scene. A mother shooting her husband and daughter? He had heard of terrible domestic violence incidents before, but something about this one gnawed at him. Harris began his investigation with the obvious questions. Who was the killer? Was it a crime of passion, a revenge killing, or something deeper? As he combed through the house, examining the crime scene, he found something curious. The gun that Mary Lou had used was registered in her name. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had tried to defend themselves. It was clear that the killer knew the victims. But it wasn't just the lack of defense that bothered Harris. It was the way the bodies were found, the placement of the shots. Something about it felt deliberate, calculated even. It didn't add up to a simple outburst of violence. Harris turned to the neighbors, hoping to gather more context about the family. What he learned only deepened his suspicions. Mary Lou and Thomas had been distant for months, but no one suspected anything of this magnitude. In fact, the Smith family had seemed normal to everyone around them, except for the occasional whispers about the strain of raising a special needs child. No one had any idea that things were as bad as they seemed behind closed doors. But then Harris learned something even more troubling. Lily had been a victim long before that fateful night. It wasn't just the betrayal that had shattered Mary Lou. It was something far darker, something that no one had known about until now. Detective Evan Harris sat in his car, the weight of the case pressing heavily on him. As he glanced out at the sun setting over the Texas horizon, he tried to piece together what had just happened at 1422 Tarrant Avenue. A mother had killed her husband and daughter, and yet there was more to this story than the obvious conclusion. The fact that the family seemed normal from the outside made everything feel more surreal. There had to be something more hidden beneath the surface. Harris had worked long enough in law enforcement to know that things were rarely as they seemed. There were always cracks, always little details that didn't fit the picture, and in this case the cracks were starting to show. It was late in the evening when Harris returned to the station to review the case files again. The autopsy reports had just come in, and the details only deepened the mystery. Thomas Smith had been shot once in the chest, a direct hit. The shot that killed Lily, however, had been much more deliberate. She had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. The position of the shots told Harris that this wasn't a random act of violence. Mary Lou had known exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment outburst. This was planned. But why had she killed her daughter? Was it truly out of rage over Thomas's betrayal, or was there something deeper at play? Harris knew he needed to talk to the medical examiner, Dr. Lisa Cooper, to get more insights into the autopsies. He dialed her number, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. Detective Harris, Dr. Cooper answered, her voice steady but tired. You wanted to discuss the Smith case? Yeah, Harris replied. I'm looking over the autopsy reports, and I have some concerns. Something doesn't add up here, especially with Lily. Dr. Cooper sighed. I thought you'd say that. There's something I need to share. When I was performing the autopsy on Lily, I found some signs that raised red flags. I'm not sure if you've seen it yet, but there was evidence of older injuries, specifically signs of trauma that were consistent with physical abuse. Harris's heart sank. Abuse? The mother had shot her daughter execution style, and now there was evidence that Lily had been abused for some time? This changed everything. What kind of injuries are we talking about? Harris asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There were several bruises on her arms and legs, all at various stages of healing. There were also signs of sexual assault. It's difficult to say how long this had been going on, but I would estimate it was happening for months, maybe even longer. I didn't find anything conclusive that linked Thomas directly to the abuse, but from the position of the wounds and the pattern, it's likely that he was involved. Harris's mind raced. He had suspected there was more to this family's dynamic than met the eye, but he hadn't expected something as dark as abuse. Thomas, a police officer, abusing his own daughter? Harris couldn't fathom it, but the evidence was beginning to make sense. If Mary Lou had suspected the abuse, it would explain the tragic, violent reaction that night. But there were still more questions. If Mary Lou had discovered the abuse, why hadn't she left him sooner? Why had she stayed in a marriage where she knew her daughter was suffering? Harris knew he needed to dig deeper. The more he learned, the more he realized that the Smith family's facade of normalcy had been just that, a facade. Underneath, there had been a nightmare unfolding for years. The next step was clear. Harris needed to speak with people who knew the Smith family intimately. He needed to talk to the neighbors, co-workers, and friends who might have seen the subtle signs of abuse. The community had to have noticed something. The first stop the next morning was to the local police station. Harris wanted to learn more about Thomas Smith, the man behind the badge. He had been a well-liked officer, known for his professionalism and dedication to the force. But was there a darker side to him that no one knew about? Harris sat down with Lieutenant Mark Davis, who had worked with Thomas for years. They exchanged pleasantries, but Harris wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "Lieutenant, I'm sure you know why I'm here. Thomas Smith," Harris began, his tone serious. "We've had some disturbing revelations about his personal life. I need to know what kind of man he was, especially when it came to his family." Davis paused, leaning back in his chair. "Thomas was a good cop. He was reliable. I never saw any signs that he had personal issues. He was dedicated to his family, or at least that's what he led everyone to believe. Always the doting husband, the loving father." "Did he ever talk about his daughter?" Harris pressed. "Was there any sign of trouble at home?" Davis shook his head, looking uncomfortable. "I don't know, Detective. He never really talked about Lily much. But from what I saw, he was protective of her. She had some health issues, right? She was always at home. Thomas was never the type to bring personal problems to the station." Harris narrowed his eyes. "But there were no signs of trouble, no warning signs that things might have been off at home?" Davis sighed, clearly uneasy. "I guess you could say I didn't see any signs. But now that I think about it, there were times when Thomas seemed distant, like he was preoccupied. He was always working late, and I'm sure the stress of his job got to him, but I never thought it was anything to be concerned about." Harris sat back in his chair, taking in the information. Thomas Smith had been a private man, keeping his personal life hidden behind a carefully constructed mask. He had seemed dedicated to his family, but now Harris knew that the man had been hiding something much darker beneath the surface. The abuse, the betrayal, and the violent act of murder were all connected in a tragic web. But there was still much more to uncover. If Mary Lou had been keeping her suspicions about her husband's behavior hidden for so long, who else in the family knew the truth? Harris felt the need to go back to the Smith house, to sift through the old letters, photos, and documents that might reveal more about the family's hidden life. If Mary Lou had kept quiet for so long, she had surely left something behind that could provide more insight into why she snapped that night. As Harris made his way back to the crime scene, the weight of the investigation settled on him. He knew there was still much to discover, more pieces to the puzzle that could explain this unfathomable act of violence. But for now, he had to dig deeper into the Smith family's history. What had really happened inside that house? The sun was high in the Texas sky as Detective Evan Harris drove back to 1422 Tarrant Avenue. The investigation was far from over, but with each passing moment, Harris felt the weight of the case grow heavier. The revelations about Lily's abuse had been disturbing, but now more than ever, he needed to understand how Mary Lou, a mother so devoted to her daughter, could have committed such an unspeakable act. The idea that Thomas had been abusing Lily was hard to process, especially given the man's role in the community. A cop, someone who was supposed to protect the innocent, had been the very person causing harm. It was a betrayal that seemed beyond comprehension. But there was more to this than just a tragic case of domestic violence. The fact that Mary Lou had chosen to kill her husband and then her daughter suggested a much more complicated story. As Harris approached the house, he couldn't shake the image of the crime scene from his mind. The blood-stained floor, the lifeless bodies. The gunshots had been quick, decisive. Mary Lou had taken control of the situation in a way that spoke to years of pent-up emotion and unresolved trauma. But what pushed her over the edge? What had she discovered in those final moments that made her feel there was no way out? He parked outside the house, the familiar sight of the Smith family's home now looming before him, a grim reminder of the events that had transpired. The once ordinary house, now a crime scene, stood silent under the hot Texan sun. Harris had already reviewed all the physical evidence, but there was something deeper he needed to understand. He needed to uncover the family's history, who they had been before the nightmare that had unfolded, and what had driven Mary Lou to that breaking point. Harris entered the house, now guarded by police officers who had been instructed to maintain the integrity of the crime scene. The walls, which had once witnessed the ordinary lives of the Smith family, now stood as mute witnesses to an unthinkable act. "Detective," Officer Garcia called, nodding toward the staircase leading to the upstairs rooms. "We've cleared the area. We found some personal items that might help shed light on things." Harris nodded and made his way up the stairs. Officer Garcia had already gathered several items: photographs, old letters, and even some medical records that seemed important. As Harris sifted through the documents, he came across a stack of letters from the local children's hospital where Lily had been receiving care for her developmental delays. The letters were routine: appointments, updates, and insurance paperwork. But one of the letters caught Harris's eye. It was a request for a special therapy session, specifically addressing behavioral concerns, sent just weeks before the murders. Something in the letter stood out. The tone was less about medical treatment and more about interventions for behavioral issues. It seemed like the family had been grappling with Lily's behavioral problems for a while. This added a new layer to the story. Was Lily's behavior worsening? Was Thomas's frustration with his daughter a factor in the abuse? Harris paused and carefully examined the photos that had been left behind. The Smith family had always seemed so perfect in public, but now these private moments told a different story. The pictures showed a family on vacation, attending church, celebrating birthdays, and smiling for the camera. But there was one particular picture that caught Harris's attention. An image of Mary Lou, standing beside Thomas. But her eyes weren't the eyes of a content wife. They were tired, worn out, almost as if she had been hiding something for years. The photo seemed to tell a story of a woman who had been on the edge, someone who had seen the cracks in her marriage long before she had snapped. Harris flipped through more pictures, each one showing a different moment in time. The smiles on their faces were fake. The happiness in their eyes was forced. Then at the bottom of the box, Harris found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a letter written by Mary Lou herself. The envelope was addressed to no one in particular, just the words "to whom it may concern" scrawled on the front. The letter, though not dated, seemed to be a confession, but not in the traditional sense. Harris opened it carefully, unfolding the creased paper. The handwriting was shaky, as though the writer had been crying or perhaps writing through a haze of exhaustion. The letter read, "I don't know how much longer I can take this. Thomas, my husband, the man I once loved, has changed. He's distant. He's cruel. I've tried to hold it together for Lily, for our family, but every day the anger in his eyes grows more unbearable. I've seen the way he looks at her. It's not the look of a father, but something darker. She's a burden to him. I can feel it in my bones. And me? He's forgotten me. The woman I used to be is gone, and I don't even recognize the man he's become. I don't know what I'll do when the truth finally comes out, but I can't pretend anymore. Something has to change." Harris felt his stomach tighten as he finished reading the letter. This was it, the unraveling of everything. Mary Lou had known. She had known for months, maybe even years, that something was wrong with her marriage. But the realization that her daughter had been a victim of Thomas's abuse had pushed her past the point of no return. The abuse had been a festering wound in their lives, one that Mary Lou had tried to ignore. But in the end, it had consumed her. But the letter didn't just show Mary Lou's pain. It showed her awareness of something else. She had seen the darkness in Thomas long before the final night. And yet in the letter, there was no mention of the abuse of Lily, only that Mary Lou had been exhausted and overwhelmed by the strains of the marriage. There was no mention of the other secret, the secret that would have destroyed everything. It was as if Mary Lou had been torn between loyalty to her husband and the love for her daughter. But in the end, the discovery of her husband's betrayal had pushed her over the edge. It was clear now. Thomas had been abusing their daughter, and Mary Lou had found out. The pressure of raising a special needs child, the guilt, the anger, and the betrayal had crushed her spirit. Mary Lou had been in a marriage that had long stopped serving her, but she had stayed, hoping for change, hoping for a miracle. When she found out the truth, when she saw with her own eyes the horrific reality of what was happening between her husband and her daughter, Mary Lou had made the ultimate decision to take control in the only way she knew how. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that this was a case far darker than any he had encountered. The family had been broken from the inside, their secrets buried beneath the facade of suburban perfection. What had begun as a tragic act of violence was now revealed to be the culmination of years of pain, frustration, and desperation. But even with all the pieces beginning to fit together, Harris knew there was still more to uncover. Who else had known? Were there any signs before the murders that had been overlooked? How had no one seen the cracks in the Smith family's story? The answers were out there, waiting to be found. Harris had to keep digging, for Mary Lou's sake, for Lily's sake, and for the sake of everyone who had been touched by this dark, devastating tragedy. Detective Evan Harris sat in his office, staring at the documents and photos spread out before him. Each one represented a piece of the Smith family's shattered reality, a family that, to everyone on the outside, had seemed normal. But now Harris was uncovering the cracks in their foundation, the pain and the betrayal that had been hidden for so long. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. Mary Lou had shot her husband and daughter, but what had driven her to that breaking point? Was it simply the years of suffering, or had there been something else that had triggered her deadly decision? Harris was no longer convinced that this was just a case of a mother snapping after a long history of domestic strife. No, this was something deeper. The autopsy results had confirmed that Thomas had been dead before Lily. The timeline, the manner of the deaths, and the evidence all pointed to one key fact. Mary Lou had killed Thomas first, before turning the gun on Lily. Harris couldn't understand it. Why had she killed her daughter? Was it an act of mercy? Or had Mary Lou been so consumed by the anger and betrayal that she couldn't see a way out? The one thing Harris knew for sure was that the answers didn't lie just in the crime scene, the autopsies, or the letters. They lay in the people around the Smiths, their friends, neighbors, and anyone who had known them in the years leading up to that night. Harris had already spoken with a few people, but it was time to dig deeper. He needed to uncover every hidden detail about the Smith family's life, no matter how uncomfortable or painful it might be. He started with their closest neighbor, Helen Taylor, who had lived next door to the Smith family for over a decade. Helen was in her late 60s, and she had seen the Smiths come and go, always watching the family from the safety of her own home. She had never been one to pry, but Harris hoped she might hold a key to understanding what had gone wrong in the Smith household. When Harris knocked on Helen's door, she answered promptly. Her face was tired, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She had heard the news, of course. The murders had shaken the entire community. But there was a look in her eyes that suggested she knew something more, something that might help Harris understand what had led to that tragic night. Helen, thank you for speaking with me, Harris began, his voice gentle but firm. I know this is hard, but I need to ask you about the Smiths. What can you tell me about them? Anything at all. Helen stepped aside, motioning for Harris to enter. I've lived next door to them for years, Detective. Thomas and Mary Lou were always polite, kept to themselves mostly, but lately there was something different about them. I didn't want to get involved, but after everything that's happened, I guess I can't stay quiet anymore. Harris sat down, his notebook ready. What was different? Was there anything unusual in their behavior? Anything that stood out to you? Helen sighed, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. Thomas used to be so kind, so involved with the neighborhood. He'd help with the lawn, shovel the snow in winter. But then things changed. About a year ago, I started noticing that Mary Lou seemed more withdrawn. She would sit outside by herself, always looking tired, like she was carrying a weight. And Thomas? He became more distant, didn't talk to anyone. I thought it was just the stress of his job, but there was something in his eyes, something off. Harris leaned forward. Did you ever hear anything? Arguments? Anything that might explain what happened? Helen hesitated, glancing down at her hands. I didn't hear anything directly, but there were nights when I saw them through the window, arguing. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the tension. And then, there were times when I'd see Lily playing outside by herself. I always felt bad for the girl. She seemed so lonely. Harris's heart sank as he listened to Helen. Mary Lou had been struggling. He had suspected it, but hearing it from someone who had observed the family for so long only solidified his theory. It wasn't just the emotional distance between Thomas and Mary Lou. It wasn't just the stress of raising a special needs child. Something more had been going on, something hidden from the outside world. And did you ever notice anything odd about Thomas's behavior toward Lily? Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen's face tightened. There were days when I thought I saw Thomas looking at Lily in a way that made me uncomfortable. But I never said anything. It wasn't my business. I didn't want to make trouble where there was none. But now it all makes sense. Mary Lou must have known. She must have known everything. Harris nodded grimly. Thank you, Helen. You've helped more than you know. As Harris left Helen's house, he felt a sense of urgency wash over him. This was no longer just about a mother who had snapped under the pressure of her marriage. This was about years of secrecy, hidden abuse, and betrayal. Thomas had been a monster, and Mary Lou had been his prisoner. She had tried to keep it together for so long, but when she had discovered the truth, when she had seen the horror that had been happening in her own home, she had reached her breaking point. But why had she killed Lily? That was the question that still lingered in Harris's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, some reason that Mary Lou had taken the life of her daughter. Could it have been an act of mercy? Or had Mary Lou been so consumed by rage that she couldn't see past her anger? Harris decided it was time to speak with Dr. Lisa Cooper again. The medical examiner had already uncovered crucial information about Lily's injuries, but Harris needed her expertise to help him understand Mary Lou's state of mind. He needed to know if Lily's death had been as calculated as Thomas's, or if it had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, a tragic outcome of a mind unraveling under the weight of years of abuse. At the medical examiner's office, Dr. Cooper was reviewing some new test results when Harris arrived. She greeted him with a nod and motioned for him to sit down. Detective Harris, Dr. Cooper began, her voice calm but serious. You've been digging deep into the Smith case. I know this has been difficult, but there's something you should know about Lily's autopsy that could change everything. Harris's pulse quickened. What did you find? There were traces of medication in Lily's system, Dr. Cooper said, her eyes focused on the report in front of her. It appears that Lily had been sedated before she was killed. The dosage was high enough to cause drowsiness, possibly even unconsciousness. It's not conclusive, but it raises some disturbing questions. Sedated, Harris repeated, shocked. So, you're saying Mary Lou drugged her own daughter before shooting her? Dr. Cooper nodded. It's a possibility. I can't say for sure until we run more tests. But if it's true, it would suggest that Mary Lou's actions weren't completely driven by rage. She may have been trying to protect Lily, or she could have been trying to end the suffering once and for all. Either way, the evidence points to a much more complex situation than we initially thought. Harris sat back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling over him. Mary Lou hadn't just killed in a moment of blind rage. She had carefully made a decision that involved ending her daughter's life in a way that suggested a twisted sense of mercy. It was a heartbreaking truth, one that made the whole situation even more tragic. But one thing was clear: Harris wasn't done. There were still pieces to this puzzle that needed to be uncovered. Mary Lou's motives were starting to make sense, but the true extent of the abuse, the lies, and the broken trust had yet to be fully revealed. And as he pieced together the last fragments of the Smith family's tragic history, Harris knew that the final truth would be even harder to confront. The sun had set on another sweltering Texas day, but Detective Evan Harris couldn't shake the feeling of weight pressing down on his chest. The more he dug into the Smith family's history, the more complicated the case became. What had begun as a murder investigation, a shocking act of violence, was now a tangled web of lies, abuse, and deep psychological trauma. Mary Lou Smith had killed her husband, Thomas, and their daughter, Lily, in cold blood. But why? What had driven her to commit such a horrific act, especially when it seemed like she had been a loving mother and wife for so many years? And why had she killed her daughter? Was it mercy? Was it rage? Or had it been something else entirely? Harris knew he needed to look deeper into Mary Lou's past to understand the psychological toll this marriage had taken on her. There was a reason for everything. Nothing in this case was as simple as it appeared on the surface, and the only way to get the answers was to continue peeling back the layers of the Smith family's tragic history. The next morning, Harris arrived at the local library where he had requested access to old public records. He was hoping to find more background on Mary Lou, anything that could explain how she had gotten to the point where she'd killed her own daughter. Was there a history of mental illness in the family, or had the years of abuse from Thomas pushed her beyond her breaking point? The library was quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil racing through Harris's mind. He sat down at a desk, flipping through old records, marriage certificates, and police reports. It didn't take long before something caught his attention. There, buried deep in the archives, was a case file from several years earlier. It wasn't directly related to the Smith family, but it involved Thomas Smith. The report was brief, but it mentioned an investigation into a domestic dispute between Thomas and a former girlfriend, a relationship that had ended in violence. The details were sparse, but it was enough to raise suspicion. The name of the woman involved was Jennifer Moore. She had filed a restraining order against Thomas years before he married Mary Lou, and the report detailed an incident in which Thomas had allegedly threatened Jennifer with violence after she tried to break off their relationship. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but the fact that Thomas had been involved in violent behavior in the past was troubling. Harris knew this could be a key to understanding the man behind the badge, the man who had been hiding his true nature for years. If Thomas had a history of violence before marrying Mary Lou, it would explain some of the tensions in their marriage. But what about the abuse of Lily? How deep did Thomas's darkness go? Harris needed to talk to Jennifer Moore. If she could provide insight into Thomas's behavior before Mary Lou came into the picture, it might shed light on why things had escalated so dramatically. It took a few hours, but Harris finally tracked Jennifer Moore down. She was living in a small town a few hours outside of El Paso, in a house that seemed just as modest as her life had become. Jennifer answered the door cautiously, her eyes flickering with recognition when she saw Harris's badge. "Detective Harris," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting anyone from the El Paso Police Department. What's this about?" Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Moore, I'm investigating the murders of Thomas Smith and his family. I came across your name in a past case involving a restraining order against Thomas. Can you tell me what happened between you two?" Jennifer's face tightened, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I remember it like it was yesterday. I was dating Thomas when we were both still in college. At first, everything seemed fine, but then he started changing. He would get angry over the smallest things. Nothing I did was ever good enough. He would yell, he would threaten, but I thought it was just stress from school. I thought he was just going through a phase. But then, one night, he got violent." Harris listened intently, his gut tightening. "What do you mean by violent?" Jennifer paused, her eyes clouded with the memory. "He shoved me against a wall, told me that if I ever left him, he'd make sure I'd regret it. I was scared. That's when I filed the restraining order. But after that night, I never saw him again. Not until I heard about what happened with Mary Lou and Lily." Harris felt his pulse quicken. So Thomas had a history of violence. Was it just that one incident, or did it happen more often? "No," Jennifer replied, shaking her head. "That was the only time he physically harmed me. But the threats, the emotional abuse, that lasted for a while. And I know it didn't just stop with me. After I left him, I heard rumors about him, about how he was never really over me, how he had anger issues. But I never thought he'd hurt anyone else." "Did you ever hear anything about him and Mary Lou?" Harris asked. "Do you think he could have been abusive toward her or their daughter?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't know much about their marriage, but I always had a feeling something wasn't right. Thomas always seemed so perfect on the outside, charming, respected in his job. But I know what it's like to live with someone who hides their anger behind a smile. I can't say for sure, but if he was abusive toward Mary Lou and Lily, it wouldn't surprise me. Harris's mind raced. He had known that Thomas had issues, but now he had confirmation. Thomas's violent tendencies had been present long before he'd married Mary Lou. And the emotional manipulation, the control, the threats, it all pointed to the kind of behavior that could easily escalate into full-blown abuse. But Mary Lou had stayed with him. Why? Thank you, Ms. Moore, Harris said, standing up. You've given me a lot to think about. As Harris left Jennifer's home, his mind churned with the weight of what he had learned. The pieces were slowly coming together. Thomas had a history of violent tendencies, and Mary Lou had been living in a nightmare. Trapped in a marriage with a man who had abused her, and likely their daughter, for years. But what pushed Mary Lou to kill her daughter too? Was it mercy? Or was it the culmination of years of unchecked rage and a mind finally breaking under the pressure? Harris had learned a lot, but he still didn't have all the answers. There was one more place he needed to visit, the local child services office. The case of Lily's abuse wasn't just about Mary Lou and Thomas. It was about the system that had failed her. Harris needed to find out if there had been any previous reports of abuse, any sign that someone could have stepped in before things reached this deadly point. Detective Evan Harris's mind was running in overdrive as he left Jennifer Moore's modest home. Each new piece of the puzzle only deepened the tragedy of the Smith family. Thomas's violent tendencies, long buried under the surface, had left a scar on everyone he'd encountered. His behavior toward Jennifer had been an early warning sign, but Mary Lou had stayed with him, believing perhaps that the man she once loved could change. But now Thomas was dead, and Lily was gone, and it all seemed so senseless, so preventable. The fact that Lily had been living with such abuse for so long, the thought gnawed at Harris. No child should have to endure that kind of treatment, especially not from a parent. Yet the system had failed her. Harris knew that if the authorities had intervened sooner, if someone had noticed the signs of abuse, maybe things wouldn't have escalated to murder. But the reality was clear. No one had done enough. With a heavy heart, Harris headed to the local child services office, hoping to find some trace of Lily's history that could explain how such a nightmare had been allowed to go on for so long. As he walked through the sterile, bright hallways of the government building, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the task before him. Child Protective Services, meant to safeguard children like Lily, had dropped the ball. Inside the Child Services office, Harris was greeted by a weary woman named Teresa Brown, who had worked in the department for over a decade. She was familiar with the case by now, but she didn't seem surprised when Harris mentioned Lily Smith's name. In fact, there was a quiet resignation in her voice as she led him to her desk, where files upon files sat in neat stacks. "Detective, I've been expecting you," Teresa said, her voice tired but warm. "I read the reports. It's tragic. I don't think anyone here realized just how deep the abuse went with Thomas. I wish we could have done more." Harris's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by that? Was there ever a report on Lily? Anything that might have alerted you to what was happening in that house?" Teresa sighed, leaning forward, tapping a folder in front of her. "We had some calls over the years. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary at first. A couple of anonymous tips, but nothing concrete. You have to understand, Detective, the system is overwhelmed. We get calls for all sorts of things, and we can't always prioritize every case. But I remember one particular call from about 2 years ago. Someone reported seeing Thomas yelling at Lily in the yard, roughing her up a bit. We sent someone out, but by the time we arrived, there was no sign of abuse. Mary Lou insisted it was just a misunderstanding, and we couldn't prove otherwise." Harris leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "But the signs were there." "Yes," Teresa admitted, her voice lowering. "But when the parents deny it, when the child doesn't speak up, there's very little we can do. We couldn't force the issue without concrete proof. It's a difficult position, Detective. Sometimes people don't want to see what's right in front of them." "And you didn't follow up?" Harris asked sharply. "We did, but there were no further complaints, no evidence." Mary Lou seemed adamant that nothing was wrong. And with Lily's condition, While sometimes she could be hard to read, she had trouble expressing herself fully, and we didn't want to push too hard. Harris clenched his jaw. The excuses were piling up. He knew that social workers were often overburdened, but the failure to follow up, especially after an incident involving a child, was inexcusable. Lily had been left in an unsafe environment, and now she was dead because of it. The system had failed her in a way that no one could undo. Teresa continued. We did visit the Smith household a couple more times, but nothing seemed out of place. We even offered counseling for Mary Lou, but she declined. I'll be honest, Detective. I'm frustrated with myself. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have enough to intervene. I wish I'd pushed harder. Harris could hear the guilt in her voice. Do you have any more information on the other calls or visits? Anything that might shed more light on what was happening behind closed doors? Teresa went through the files, pulling out reports and reading through them with a weary expression. There were other reports, none of them serious enough to trigger a full investigation. A few neighbors mentioned hearing yelling, but those reports were vague. No one was ever able to confirm anything. And by the time we were called, Thomas was always there, covering for Mary Lou, making excuses. It's not that we didn't try, it's just that she trailed off, clearly struggling with the enormity of the case. Harris understood. The system was strained, and it was easy to overlook one more case in a sea of hundreds, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. If the system had done its job, if someone had followed up on that report about Thomas and Lily in the yard 2 years ago, perhaps Mary Lou would have gotten the help she needed, and Lily would still be alive. Harris knew he had to get to the bottom of this, not just for Mary Lou and Lily, but for every child who was suffering in silence. The failure of the system couldn't be ignored. And while Mary Lou was the one who had taken the lives of her husband and daughter, she was also a victim in her own right. She had been trapped in a marriage where the man she loved had become a monster. She had seen the signs, but she had been too scared to act. By the time she finally reached her breaking point, it was too late for any intervention. Thank you for your time, Teresa, Harris said, standing up. I know this case hasn't been easy on anyone, but you've given me a clearer picture of what happened. It wasn't just about the abuse. It was about the system turning a blind eye when it should have stepped in. Teresa nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. I just wish I could have done more. Harris walked out of the office, his mind swirling with the new information. He had learned about Thomas's past with Jennifer Moore, the calls to child services, and the years of pain that had built up within Mary Lou. Now it was time to confront her, to get her side of the story and finally understand what had truly happened the night she killed her husband and daughter. The community had failed her, and the system had failed Lily. But Mary Lou was still alive, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. Harris was determined to get to the bottom of everything, no matter how painful or complicated the truth might be. Detective Evan Harris had gathered all the pieces. The pieces that had once been scattered, unclear and disturbing, were now beginning to form a tragic picture. A picture of a mother, a daughter, and a husband trapped in a house of horrors. Harris had been on this case long enough to know that the truth, while painful, would eventually come to light. And today he hoped would be the day that Mary Lou Smith would finally tell him everything. He had met with every neighbor, every colleague, and every person connected to the Smith family. He had seen the painful cracks in their lives that no one had been able or willing to address. And now, after weeks of investigation, it was time to speak to the woman at the center of it all. Harris had arranged for a meeting at the county jail. Mary Lou had been taken into custody the day after the murders. And though she had remained silent for much of the investigation, there was a part of Harris that believed she was waiting for the right moment to confess. He had to get her to open up, to explain what had driven her to kill the man she had once loved and the daughter she had sworn to protect. When Harris entered the interrogation room, Mary Lou was already sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and her expression vacant, almost as though she were somewhere else entirely. The months of living in a shell of grief and guilt had taken their toll on her, but the moment she saw Harris, something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of recognition, of resignation. She knew this moment was coming. Mary Lou, Harris began gently, sitting across from her. I know this hasn't been easy. I know you've been through hell. But I need you to understand something. Your daughter, Lily, she didn't deserve to die. And Thomas, he didn't deserve to die either. But you have to explain to me why it happened. Mary Lou didn't speak at first. She just stared at the table, her fingers twitching nervously. Harris could tell she was struggling with her emotions. She was close to breaking, and he could feel the moment coming. Mary Lou, we have all the pieces. We know about Thomas's history, about the abuse, about everything that led up to that night. But you're the only one who can explain it. Why did you do it? Why did you kill your daughter? Mary Lou's eyes met his, and for the first time her gaze seemed more focused. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, Harris wasn't sure if she would speak. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I didn't want to kill her. I never wanted to. Harris' heart clenched at her words. This wasn't the cold confession of a murderer. This was a woman who had been pushed to the edge of her sanity by years of suffering. He waited, allowing her the time she needed to gather her thoughts. It wasn't just the abuse, she continued, her voice shaking. It was everything. I loved Thomas once. I thought we could make it work. But he changed. He wasn't the man I married. He became cruel, distant. And then, when I found out what he was doing to Lily, it broke me. Mary Lou's eyes filled with tears. Harris could see the anguish in her face. But it wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper. It was the pain of years of denial, years of trying to make her marriage work and failing miserably. I tried to protect her, detective. I tried to do everything I could, but Thomas wouldn't let me. And Lily, she was so vulnerable. She couldn't fight him off. She couldn't tell anyone what was happening. I saw it, but I didn't know how to stop it. Harris felt a knot in his stomach. He understood now. Mary Lou had known. She had known all along, but she had been paralyzed by fear and self-doubt. She had stayed in a marriage that was slowly killing her, and by the time she had learned the full truth about Thomas's abuse, it had been too late. I tried to leave him, Mary Lou continued, her voice trembling. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I didn't know how. I didn't have the strength. And then one night, I found them. I walked in and saw him doing things to her, things no father should ever do to his daughter. Her face crumpled and the tears began to fall freely. Harris didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let her unravel the truth that had been buried for so long. I grabbed the gun, Mary Lou said, her voice breaking. I didn't even think. I just wanted to stop him, to stop everything. I didn't know what else to do. I shot him, and then I saw Lily. She was standing there, just staring at me. She was terrified. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what I was doing. And then I shot her. Mary Lou collapsed in on herself, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. The room was filled with the sound of her sobs, and Harris knew she was reliving the nightmare she had tried to bury. I didn't want to hurt her, detective. I loved her. She was all I had. But I couldn't save her from him. I couldn't save either of them. I didn't know what to do anymore. Harris sat there, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had suspected the abuse, but hearing it from Mary Lou, hearing the full extent of her pain, was something he hadn't been prepared for. This wasn't just a murder case. This was a tragedy on a scale he hadn't fully grasped until now. You were trapped, weren't you, Mary Lou? Harris said softly. You were trapped in a marriage, in a life. You couldn't escape. And when you found out what he had done to Lily, it pushed you past your breaking point. Mary Lou nodded, still unable to stop crying. I didn't know what to do. I thought I was protecting her, but I killed her, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Harris felt a mix of sympathy and sorrow for the woman sitting before him. She had been a victim too, trapped in a cycle of abuse, unable to escape. But no matter how much sympathy he felt, there was still the matter of justice. The lives of Thomas and Lily had been taken, and Mary Lou had to face the consequences of her actions. I'm sorry, Mary Lou, Harris said quietly, but you can't escape this. You took 2 lives. You need to take responsibility for what you've done. Mary Lou nodded, her face a mask of grief and guilt. I know. I didn't know how to stop. Harris sat in silence, allowing her to process the weight of her confession. He knew that this was the moment that would define the rest of her life. the moment when she would have to face the consequences of everything she had done. But he also knew that Mary Lou was a victim in her own right. The system had failed her. And now the only thing left was for justice to be served. As Harris stood up to leave, he took one last look at Mary Lou. Her head was bowed, her shoulders hunched in defeat. There was no turning back for her now. The truth had come out, and all he could do was hope that somehow, through all the pain, some measure of healing could begin. For Mary Lou, for Lily, and for the shattered remnants of a family lost in the darkness of abuse.